Well, good morning. Red Skelton, if that name means anything to you, you old timers, a comedian of the past. He said something that describes how I'm feeling right now. He said, "Late to bed and early to rise makes me sleepier than most other guys." I'm not a morning person. I can't see most of you, but that's okay. That's okay. When y'all are sleeping, 2 o'clock in the morning, I do my best work. Okay, I'm down here on the floor because I'm doing a lecture that I got a feeling many of you have seen several times because it's a staple of this conference. How many of you seen my timeline lecture on the resurrection? Okay. How many of you have seen it more than once? Okay, we should start going around the room and say, I've seen it 14 times. I've given it over 2,000 times, so I have to put up with it again. But, I'll tell you something, I never fail to get excited about this lecture, no matter how many times I do it, because it concerns the greatest event in the world. And every time I do it, I marvel at how well evidenced Christianity is. See, many, many years ago, look at my watch this time, I didn't do it yesterday. I went through 10 years of doubt. A lot of you know my story. And I'm one of these guys who got into apologetics because I had questions. And I needed to solve my own questions. And I felt like I was slipping from the faith. I was raised in a German Baptist church. And I just thought we couldn't ground Christianity. And people were coming to me and saying, well, look at this argument, and look at that argument, and you should study creation, and you should look at archaeology, and you should look at reliability of the New Testament, and what about this, and what about that? And I would just get into each topic, it seemed like just a little bit. I'd say, yeah, this can't hold the weight of my faith. And yeah, that's cool, but that one really can't do it either, and so on. And one day it occurred to me, I didn't know too many of the people writing in this field, and I made a discovery that many, many, many Christians have made down through the centuries. Namely, that if the resurrection was what it was cooked up to be, it could bear the weight of our faith. In fact, Richard Swinburne, along with Alvin Plantinga, probably the two most influential philosophers in the world, calls the resurrection a super miracle. A super miracle. There's nothing like it in the world religions. And I had studied the world religions because I thought I was going off the deep end. In fact, I told my mother one time, she checked with me and I wasn't living home, and I think I'd finished my grad studies at that time. And she said, how are you coming with your questions? And I said, I think I'm a few months from becoming a Buddhist. I told her that. She was really impressed. But as I studied some of the other religions and traditions, one thing I realized is virtually no religion even has apologetics. And those that do don't have anything that would measure up seriously to maybe our 10 best evidences. Christianity is alone in the wealth of information we have. And at the top of that list is the resurrection of Jesus. And I hope you'll see why. But today, the resurrection is more respected probably than it's ever been before. I'm the guy that reads the sources and does a head count. I've got a document, actually 2 documents on my computer that measure almost 800 pages, and it's where contemporary scholarship is today on 140 sub-issues related to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. 140 major questions. And I don't comment on it. This isn't a book. All I do is line scholars up where they are. What kind of spectrum of belief is there on each of these questions? And it's 800 pages long, just giving you a who's who. And from that, I realized that the majority of scholars today, more than not, believe that something actually happened to Jesus. Now, to me, the watershed and how you define this is this. You're on the conservative side to varying degrees. I tell my students, there's a lot of difference between B- conservatives and A+ conservatives. I mean, there's a wide range of views. And on the quote-unquote liberal side, there's a lot of difference between a C- and an F. Notice what side of the spectrum I'm giving them. But here's the watershed issue. Whenever what happened, do you believe it happened to Jesus, or do you believe it happened to the disciples only? If it happened to the disciples only, i.e., they had a transforming psychological experience, we all have that in church once in a while, you're on the liberal side of the spectrum. If you think all that happened to the disciples. On the other side is something happened to Jesus. The Jesus who was dead just a short time before, something happened to him. That's kind of the watershed event. What do you do with these experiences that the disciples had? Now, how do we get there? How do we find this out? I told you I would start with the story today, if I remembered it. Told you one about my son last night, the joke that the students told. What does the weather have to do with the resurrection? And my son, we were at the dinner table one night, and he had been asked by a Sunday school teacher, I guess it was Easter season. He was only about 8 years old at the time. And he said, "Dad, how do we know that Jesus is raised from the dead?" And I thought to myself, I wonder if he even has an idea of how much, that this is the area I work most in, but this is the assignment they had in Sunday school class. How do we know that Jesus was raised from the dead? Well, you know how it is when you're eating. Number of people sitting there. We had 4 children, so 6 of us at the table, and we get talking, and I said, "Rob, how do we know George Washington is first president of the United States?" He said, "No, come on, Dad. How do we know Jesus was raised from the dead?" And I said, "Come on, Rob. How do we know that George Washington is first president of the United States?" He wasn't sure where I was going, but he decided to answer the question, and he said, "I don't know. I guess we've got to read books." I said, "All right. What kind of books? Some books are better than others. What kind of books do you want to read to see if George Washington is first president of the United States?" And he said, "Old ones." I said, "Okay. What qualifies as an old book that would help us with George Washington?" He's got to think it through this for the first time. And he said, "Well, I guess we should have some books by people who knew him." Okay, that's good, Rob. I mean, that's a really good start. Books by people who walked and talked with George Washington. Now, Rob, you may not know this, but George Washington was a general before he was a president. And he fought in some famous wars, and he did some famous government work and put some famous documents together. And how do we handle that? Well, I guess we need somebody who knew him when he was a general, and we need somebody to know him who helped put these documents together, and it'd be neat. Maybe we have a diary or something he wrote, and somebody who knew him as the first president of the United States. Well, we never finished our conversation. You know how things go at the dinner table. I never got to Jesus. We're only talking about George. And a couple weeks later at the dinner table, I said, "Rob, how'd that go for you?" He said, "Well, I went to church the next week, and the teacher said, 'How do we know Jesus was raised from the dead?'" And I think probably he was expecting the students to say, "Jesus has been raised from the dead because the Bible tells me so." This, by the way, is Tom Wright's New Testament translation. If any of you have seen this, it's a pretty provocative translation. It's well done. But But I think he probably wanted someone to say, the Bible tells me so, right? And so the teacher said, how do we know Jesus was raised from the dead? And Rob said, I put my hand up. And the teacher said, Rob? And Rob said, how do we know George Washington was raised from the dead? No, he didn't say raised from the dead. He said, how do we know George Washington was your first president? And the teacher said, what? 8-year-olds? What? And then he said, oh yeah, you're Habermas's kid, aren't you? But here's my point. You check out the resurrection of Jesus the same way you check out ancient history. History's history. The process is the same. If you're a Christian who does science, you do science like other scientists do science. If you're a medical doctor, you do medicine the way medicine's done. You want state-of-the-art material, right? You don't want a witch doctor. You want a medical doctor. And if you want to do history, you do history the way history's done. Now, how do you do history? Well, that's a whole other topic. We teach a course on philosophy of history, historiography, kind of a how would you know an historical event if it hit you between the eyes kind of question. And that's a different subject. But for now, I'll say there's several important things you need to have good historical data. We need texts. If possible, we need artifacts. You know, if you're going to study the Civil War, I live in Virginia. More battles were fought in Virginia than any other state. By the way, more soldiers died from North Carolina than from any other state. And Appomattox, where the Civil War ended, is just a few miles from my house, about 15-minute drive. And you can see where, the war ended. And along the way, there's little tiny cemeteries here and there where little skirmishes were fought. And a lot of Civil War soldiers are buried right there along the road, coming into and going out of Appomattox Courthouse, where the war ended. Those are artifacts. We have artifacts. And someone says, well, I have some Civil War musket balls. Okay. I have a Civil War rifle. Oh, that's cool. There's a kind of a bayonet kind of deal. Here's a uniform. And here's this and here's that. So you have sources, you have artifacts, and for at least, not at least, but for maybe a maximum of 100 years, you have people you can interview, right? You have written testimony for many people who don't live anymore, but you might have, for the first 100 years, living testimony. I remember, it was a long time ago, but I remember in 1960, it was the centennial of the Civil War. And we were caught up with all things Civil War in this country. And there were a few soldiers who were still alive who had fought in the Civil War. Now, to my way of thinking, it seems like there were 3. They were all from the South, from the Confederacy. So I would imagine that these folks had been little boys who maybe followed the troops out and maybe had a squirrel rifle or something. Who knows? Maybe they were 7 or 8 and went out to battle with the troops because they wanted to be with their dad or fight for their country or whatever. And they were probably a little over 100 years old. And because I'm interested in history, every time someone does an interview with somebody who's 95, 100, 105, I'm really interested. Because I wonder what testimony looks like at that time. I have an interview in my files from a professional baseball player who played at the end of the 1800s when this interview was done, and he was 105. And he had a very clear memory, and he could give us details about what baseball was like, professional baseball, about 1895. So I keep these articles because the way we do the historicity of the resurrection is the way we do history. It's similar. It's not like religious history, or we're going to say the resurrection happened because God told us to say that, and that's my evidence. See, a lot of religions, that's the kind of evidence they have. Well, God spoke to me. Okay. I had this really neat experience, to which a good friend of mine, John Warwick Montgomery, used to say to people when they said, I've had this experience with God, he would say, and how do you know it's not heartburn? How do you know the difference between your experience and heartburn? Do you have some reasons to differentiate? You need to track these things to the real world. Okay, well, two of the things for ancient history that are really helpful, just, this is a seminary, this is grad school, so let's keep it real simple. I've written so many books on the resurrection, I think 20-ish, that I tell my PhD students, you won't keep the titles all separate, so we're going to go by colors, okay? PhD, colors. Take out the orange book. Take out the white book. Okay, well, these are the two E's. The two E's. When you do history, it would be really helpful if we had early and eyewitness testimony. These two are very, very important. Early and eyewitness testimony. Now, not all testimony is early. You could say, aren't all eyewitnesses early? Not necessarily. For example, I heard about a fellow who fought in World War II, and he was writing his memoirs of World War II in the 1990s. Now, that's pretty close. That's 50-ish years. But maybe his memory would be fresher if he wrote it 1 year after the war was over. So not all witnesses are early, but if you have early eyewitnesses, you have a good start. Now, critics might say, well, but you have a problem. Y'all are using the New Testament, aren't you? And critic might say, I'm not a Christian, so I'm not inclined to allow your source. At least not the way you use it. See, I might use Homer, the Iliad, or the Odyssey, but I'm not going to use it the way Homer used it. I don't think everything in the Iliad or the Odyssey is true. But if I'm doing a book on ancient Greek thought, I do want to know what Homer says. Tom Wright says that for ancient Greeks, think about this, for ancient Greeks, these works were such classics. He said Homer was their Old Testament and Plato was their New Testament. It's a different way to think about things. All right, so how would I look at their source, their Old Testament, Homer? Well, I'm going to be really, really critical. But I think that Homer gets some things right. He's going to say some things that are historically correct. And critics look at the New Testament like that. Inspired? No way. Especially if they're an atheist. No. But are some things that are, the New Testament reports are true? Yeah. Well, how do we do it? Now, the method I'm going to use this morning, in all my resurrection arguments, occasionally I'll try to argue the New Testament is reliable, but I almost never go that way. I use a strategy, and that's what it is. It's a methodology. It's a way to do things. It's not the things themselves. It's a way to do things, and I call it the minimal facts argument. And I want to be real clear about this. Today, I'm basically only going to use data that are allowed by the critics. And a lot of people think that I am doing in print, they say, oh, Habermas is doing a logical fallacy. He's using the argument from authority, and that's a fallacy. Okay, first of all, a couple of things about the argument from authority. The argument from authority is not necessarily a fallacy. It depends on how you do it. For example, if you're not feeling well, you go to an authority. I said last night, you go to a medical doctor. You don't ask your paper boy why you have the flu or why you have a toothache. You go to an authority. So in a way, going to an authority is what you want to do. But if you say that because an authority says so, therefore it's true, that's a fallacy. Because, you're going to have an authority that says the opposite, too. So, but secondly, I don't argue from authority. Oh, yes, you do. You count all the heads, and you have this document, and you count 140 topics, and you say, the majority of scholarship says. But I don't argue that because the majority of scholarship says it, it's true. There's a prior question. Why do the majority of scholars concede this data? If atheists, agnostics, liberals, moderates, and conservatives all concede something, that's probably a sign that there's pretty good evidence for it. So my first and by far the most prominent rule is I will not use any data that are not multiply evidenced by other pieces of data. And I just gave you examples of what that would be like. Living witnesses, written witnesses, traces like archaeology, a musket, a bayonet, a uniform, a house. This house was built prior to the Civil War. So here you get an idea of what a house might look like in those days. These are artifacts. And we have artifacts with Jesus. We talk about things like the empty tomb. We might talk about other things. We may talk about manuscripts. So you put all these together, and what do you come up with? So I'm only going to use data today, which are evidenced so widely that the vast majority of scholarship is going to allow them. Now, this is way more of an introduction I usually give. Bob's given me up to an hour to do this, so this is really cool, and this is seminary for many of you, and so I'm going to be giving you a little more data today. So that's a process I use. I'm not going to say that something's true because the Bible says it's true. I'm going to say it's true because we have data for it. And by the way, I think that's the way the Bible teaches that. Now, I was doing this lecture in a large church a few years ago. It's a very large church. And I was doing this lecture, and a very well-known atheist walked in the back. It was a really big auditorium, but I could see him back there, and I had talked with him the previous day. I knew he lived in the area. And I saw him walk in, and I thought, great. This is for popular consumption, and he's probably going to judge what I'm saying from what I say here and so on. So he came up afterwards, and he and I have become really good friends. He's a big football fan. He's an Indianapolis Colts fan. I'm a big hockey and football fan, those two sports. I'm not a soccer fan. That's another thing. If they tackled, I'd be a soccer fan. And if they quit falling on the ground and grabbing their shins and the replay shows nobody touched them, I'd be more of a soccer fan. That's an aside. Okay. And I used to coach university ice hockey for 9 years. I was a head coach, so I love hockey. Okay. So he and I will talk football. And he came up to me after I gave this lecture and he said, "Hey, I heard your lecture today." Okay. He said, "It's amazingly simple." And I thought, all right, is this a slam or is he giving me a compliment? It's an amazingly simple lecture, and then he finished the sentence, "and I don't have a clue how to respond to it." Now, how neat is a lecture that you can take, and maybe some of you, a lot of you have heard this more than once, because none of it's difficult. You can take it and do it for a Sunday school class of third graders. You literally can. You have to leave out certain things, but you can do it for third graders. And you can do it for PhD students. In fact, I've given this lecture at both Oxford and Cambridge and Edinburgh. And it's a very sophisticated lecture, but it's very simple. Okay, what I'm going to start doing today is I'm going to mark off a timeline up here. We're going to do history the way we do history. And I'm going to ask, what kind of data do we have for the resurrection of Jesus? And at the beginning, at least, I'll do a little bit of comparisons to what kind of data we have for other religious or historical events from this time. And I'm only going to be able to do that briefly. That's why I'm down here on the floor, so I can walk the whole time. I've got a PowerPoint for this, but I better be careful. I don't use it. I was doing this in Oxford, and a British guy said to me, "You don't need a PowerPoint. You're a human PowerPoint." So that's what I'm going to do, Dan. Human PowerPoint. This is ground zero. This is the death of Jesus. That's creation. That's 2014. This is ground zero. I say ground zero because scholars aren't unanimously agreed about what year it was when Jesus died. Most popular year, 30 AD. And for those who don't say 30 AD, the next most popular one is not 31. The next most popular year is 33. Okay, so this is ground zero. And how far down our timeline do we have to go before we get to the first and most credible witness for the resurrection of Jesus? I'm going to give you two arguments for the resurrection. I'm only going to outline one real briefly, and then I'm going to quit talking about that one and do my minimal facts argument. But here's the old argument. Here's the way I learned it in school, and this is the way that most apologists still do it today. They'll say, "Oh, you want to know about Jesus?" And of course, here's Jesus' public ministry. But if you want to know a little bit about Jesus, here's how you do it. You ask, what are our major sources? And let me introduce to you Mark. Now, I'm going to use critics' dates. They're not that much different than evangelicals. Some evangelicals use the same dates. But you might think, oh, it's a little bit later than when we were taught in New Testament intro. Because I'm going to do it the way the critics do it, to tell you that even on their presuppositions, we've got a great argument. Okay, so on their argument, people are going to say, well, let's talk about Mark at 60 to 75 AD. Critics' date. Mark, 60 to 75 AD. All right, and then we have another source, Matthew, from about 80 AD. That's pretty cool because we're only plus 50. So right here with Matthew and Luke at about 85, critics' date, we're at about the same amount of time as that person I told you about who was writing his memoirs of World War II in the 1990s. We're at about 50, 55 years afterwards. And everybody puts John at about 95 or plus 65. Whoops. Tell me where I have to go. Is this still on? It is? Okay. Plus 65. Now, let's change the parameters a little bit. This is the death of Alexander the Great. We know a lot about Alexander, right? Debated an atheist here a couple years ago for the Greer-Hurd lectureship, and we respond, different people respond to each other. And I asked one of the atheists, do we know a lot about Alexander the Great? And he said, yeah, we do. Know a lot about Alexander. But he had just gotten done saying, the Gospels are so late after the ministry of Jesus. So late, at a maximum of 65 years, and we allow people who do their memoirs of World War II at plus 55, plus 60? That's late? Yeah, well, there's miracles in it too. It's a religious book. All right, let's think about that. But let's think about Alexander. What's our earliest large, detailed work for Alexander? And using a timeline very much like Jesus's, this is Alexander. Our earliest sources for Alexander are about 300 years after he died. Oh yeah, but we could know a lot about Alexander. Right, but the Gospels are just really too late at 65, aren't they? Yeah. The best sources for Alexander, I don't know what's outside the building there, but way out there. The best sources for Alexander are Plutarch and Arrian at plus 425 to 450. And John's just way too bad at 65, isn't he? And Mark's way too bad at 30 to 40. Yeah, well, here's the difference. These Gospels are prejudiced. Oh. Well, this is like the Swedish historian I told you about that I had the dialogue with last night. He said, "You're a Christian. So you're prejudiced." Ah. But you're not prejudiced when you study Alexander, are you? So that's why you need to take an intro to philosophy class. We're all prejudiced. We all have an axe to grind. We all have a perspective. If I tell you I went to a German Baptist church, I'm telling you a little bit about my angle on life. If I tell you I'm a man, if I tell you I'm from Detroit, if I tell you my family and I live in Virginia, I'm telling you things about me. If I tell you I'm Republican, if I tell you I like the Green Bay Packers, I'm telling you things about myself. But you football fans, you'd say, if you're a Green Bay Packer fan, you're warped, right? Because I'm telling you something about me. And prejudice is like perspective. We all wear glasses, and the glasses are of different colors. So mine would be a combination of German Baptist, male, Detroit, Virginia, hockey, professor, PhD, 4 children, okay? And that's the angle that I look at things with. We all have perspective. And historians who study Alexander have perspectives. Why did they choose history as a field? That's perspective. I like it. Oh, okay. You like it, but you don't have an angle, do you? No. And I think that's naive. I think those are naive comments. I think they need to study philosophy. First perspective. Oh, wait a minute. Your Gospels record miracles. Your Gospels record miracles. Yes, they do. And how does Plutarch's Alexander start out? Alexander was born of a virgin, and his father was one of the Greek gods. Well, it's a good thing this isn't about the supernatural. Now, this might bother you. You might say, it says his mother was a virgin? Well, Suetonius tells us that Caesar Augustus' mother was a virgin. Oh, you say, I get the idea this might be kind of common in the ancient world. Did Christians copy off that? Well, Suetonius wrote about Caesar about 120 AD, almost 100 years after Jesus. And the one who said Alexander was born of a virgin mother is Plutarch at about 400 to 450 years after Alexander. He also wrote about 120 AD. They're post-Christian. But anyway, my point. Yeah, but you guys believe in miracles. So do they. Yeah, but as the Swedish historian told me, I don't believe in those things. I just read them. Okay. But what if what we talked about last night is true? And Craig Keener's right? Or Richard Kasdorf is right? Or Gardner's right? Or other people who have done studies of contemporary miracles? And what if these things happen? What if naturalism is wrong? And this is a supernatural world. And we have blinders on. They're called naturalistic blinders. And just because you think you're scientific because you don't believe in miracles, that doesn't mean they don't happen. An example I used last night, what do you do when a pastor prays for a child with a club foot and the doctor watches that little foot open right up? What do you do? And do you have pre and post x-rays? Do you have pre and post CAT scan? Do you have pre and post MRI? Then what do you do with the data? I don't believe it. You've got it right here. What if these things happen? What if miracles happen in the world? Are these books automatically irresponsible? All right, I'll let that one sit. But a lot of people argue for the resurrection by saying, here's 4 major books, and we have some other writers, and these are good sources for the resurrection. I'm going to use a different argument because critics unanimously say the best source for Jesus is the Apostle Paul. That might puzzle you a little bit. I won't be able to go into detail with that. But one of the reasons is critics don't think we know the authors of the 4 Gospels. But they will grant you that of the 13 books that bear Paul's name in the New Testament, they will always grant that 6 to 8 of those books are authentic. What do I mean? 6 to 8 of those books were authentically written by Paul, and Paul is a very important early source. Why? Remember, how do you know George Washington's first president of the United States? How do you know Paul's an authoritative source? Because Paul's early, he's eyewitness. You say, well, we don't know if he knew Jesus. No, but we do know that he knew Jesus' apostles, right? He says he knew James, the brother of Jesus. He knew Peter. He knew others. Paul is in the right place at the right time to be giving us right data. Now, this little problem about critics will give you 6 to 8 of the 13 Pauline books. What books will they give you? They'll always give you the same list because they think that these books are the most reliable. They'll always give you probably the books that you would want. If you were saying, okay, well, what sources are you going to give me from Paul? They're going to give you Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. They'll always give you those books. Bart Ehrman, about whom I'll be saying a lot in this lecture. Bart Ehrman is now the best-known skeptic in North America and one of the best-known skeptics in the world. He calls himself an agnostic leaning toward atheism, and he used to be an evangelical. He's one of the most prominent New Testament scholars in the world. And Bart Ehrman calls these the undisputed Pauline letters. Undisputed Pauline letters. Contrary to popular opinion, if you're one of these people that go on into chat rooms and chat with atheists, and you get the rabble-rousing kind of atheist, the kind that doesn't know what they're talking about, the kind that has no degrees, the kind that just knows he can't stand you or what you're talking about, they're often angry. Okay, footnote. Often angry. Do you know that in a recent psychological study, one of the largest people groups exhibiting anger toward God is atheists? Now, let's think about this. They exhibit anger toward the God they don't believe in. 19% of atheists in this one survey, 19% of atheists are angry about God. They have a chip on their shoulders. And they will tell you, just like we do, the knife cuts both ways, everybody wants to be an intellectual. They'll tell you, I'm an atheist because your evidence stinks. You don't have any. So being the intellectual that I am, I was raised in a Christian home. That might have meant they went to Sunday school when they were 5 years old. I was raised in a Christian home, but I rejected it because your evidence stinks. Really? Is that why you became an atheist? As somebody who's done 3 books on doubt, and by the way, this is just a pastoral note, footnote. On my website, GaryHabermas.com, there's all kinds of information on resurrection. Nothing's for sale. But under the books tab, 2 of my 3 out-of-print books on doubt are there. So if you're going through something, you know somebody is going through something, you want to download a book, be my guest. 2 to 3 books on doubt. Okay. So I've studied doubt and the kind of psychological makeup of people who doubt, and by far, as I said last night, the majority of doubters doubt for emotional reasons. Christians too, knife cuts both ways. We like to appear intellectual, and we make decisions primarily for emotional reasons. Even guys, even Germans, even German guys make emotional decisions. Like I told you, I'm German, so I'm not trying to pick on them. I'm picking on my family in a way. Yes, but we'd like to tell people this. I'm all about the intellect. I'm German, don't you know? My patron saint is Mr. Spock. Live long and prosper. Really? No, that's not what life's about. Life is about your circumstances. And if you've been burned by somebody the opposite gender, you may not want to get married. You may hate people of the opposite gender because that's an emotional experience. And if you think if somebody in your life very close to you died and you prayed and prayed and prayed to God, as C.S. Lewis said, and his mother didn't come back to life when he was an 8-year-old, he decided either there was no God or at the very least he didn't care about him. And a lot of the folks who change from evangelicalism to atheism do so because of an emotional experience. I could go through the guys' lives, the guys who are the big atheists, and tell you what happened, because they'll tell you in their books. It's emotional. But the knife cuts both ways. Christians decide on emotional reasons too. All right. So they'll often say to you, they're ticked, and they say they reject these suggestions for factual reasons, and they rarely do. Back to Paul. So they're going to grant Paul, and they'll let you use these books. Scholars, but the guys in the chat rooms, they're going to say this. I won't let you use this book because it's prejudiced. Well, how about you? Oh, no, I'm not prejudiced because I don't have any beliefs, see, religious beliefs. So I'm not prejudiced, but you do because you have religious beliefs. And I say to them, take a philosophy course. It'll straighten you out. The people who go in the chat rooms who call themselves scholars because they want to be scholars, they don't want to have come from broken homes and have incredibly emotional experiences, and that's why they reject God. They're going to say, I've read everything there is to read on this subject, and they've probably read 20 pages if you're lucky. And they reject for intellectual reasons. No, they don't. Almost no one does. Almost no one believes for intellectual reasons. We believe or reject because of felt needs. That's who we are. We're human beings. All right, I'm not talking about the guys in the chat rooms who don't know what they're talking about because they don't have any training. I'm talking about professional critics who know what the data say. That's why I use Bart Ehrman as an example. And they will let you use those 8 books because they're very well attested. There's virtually no scholar out there. G.A. Wells, he doesn't believe Jesus even existed. Or if he did, he was a very obscure, who knows what century he lived in person. And yet G.A. Wells says there are 8 authentic epistles of Paul, the ones I just gave you, plus Colossians he'll give you. All right, so my second argument, I'm going to use the Pauline books they give me, the scholars. I don't care about what the rabble says, just like when I'm teaching my classes. I don't let people without degrees and who haven't studied this in any detail get up and teach the class. The knife cuts both ways on both sides. We have people who get PhDs for a reason, and there are skeptics who have PhDs. And they talk the same language, but they believe different things. But you can dialogue because the data are in common. Okay, I'm going to start with Paul, and I'm going to say that Paul's epistles are basically written, the authentic epistles are basically written in the 50s. Now, since he's martyred about 62, 63, none of the authentic Pauline epistles could be later than 62 or 63. Does that make sense? That just, unless he wrote them from heaven or something, that They're not going to be later than his martyrdom. All right, I'm going to use just 2 chapters today, both unanimously granted by critical scholars. I don't care what critical non-scholars say. Critical scholars. I use 1 Corinthians 15 and the end of Galatians 1, beginning of Galatians 2. Now, in the originals, there are no chapter dividings there. So that's one text, into Galatians 1, beginning of Galatians 2, 1 Corinthians 15. Now, here's ground zero, right? 30-ish AD. And Paul's writing Corinthians, makes no difference if you're liberal, conservative. Paul writes Corinthians somewhere around 53 to 56 AD. So we're at approximately plus 25. Plus 25. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, now when I go to secular campuses, I begin with 1 Corinthians 15. And this is really cool because on the secular campus, I give them the gospel. I give them the plan of salvation. They don't even know I'm doing it. Because it's advertised that Habermas is speaking on the resurrection. I'm only telling you what the text says. And by far the key text is 1 Corinthians 15. And here's how the text starts. So I want to put this in context. And this allows me to talk about the gospel in their campus. Because here's how Paul starts. 1 Corinthians 15:1. He says, when I came to you, Corinthians, I preached the gospel to you. And then I'll stop and I'll tell the crowd, here's an informational footnote. There's 2 sides to the gospel. Christianity believes that the gospel has factual content. There was a Jesus who did certain things. And there's a personal content. What are you going to do with Jesus? Because even demons believe and tremble, according to the New Testament. So there's 2 sides, God's side and our side. Who Jesus is, what he's done, and what's your response. So I'm saying all this, I'm unpacking the passage for them, I'm doing what they came to hear me do. And anymore, it's a really neat development. I used to be sponsored by Christian groups on these university campuses. Now, I'm frequently co-sponsored by a Christian group and by an atheist group on campus. That's really cool. The Habermas is being brought to campus by the Free Thinker Society. Cool. That's neat. People without glasses and people without prejudice. That's how they see themselves. And they're real friendly, and usually the president of each group comes up and gives a quick introduction. About half the crowd is Christian, about half the crowd are non-Christians. And I'm giving them the gospel. And I'll say, whenever the gospel's defined, God's side, these 3 events are always present. Deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. Deity, death, resurrection. We often say death, burial, resurrection, but burial really isn't mentioned all that many times whenever the gospel's defined. Deity, death, resurrection. And then Paul says, verses 1 and 2, what you did with Jesus determines whether or not you're a believer. I say it this way. According to the New Testament, what you do with Jesus determines where you spend eternity. Now see, they sound like they're getting an evangelical message, but hey, I came here to speak on the resurrection. I'm just putting it in the context. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 and 2. I define the gospel. I tell them that the word believe is a very strong word in the New Testament. It's not like English, where you say, I believe George Washington's first president of the United States, and it takes no commitment on my part. In the New Testament, to believe the way the New Testament talks about it is to make a commitment to somebody. I think the closest phrase that we have in English is, I do. Now, when you get married, there's a factual side. I know a lot about this person. We think somebody who doesn't know a lot about the person is stupid, right? You hear these silly movies and things where you go to Vegas and what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and you're in a hotel room and you wake up the next morning and someone's lying next to you and you have no idea who that person was and there's a ring on your finger. Oh no. What did I do in a drunken stupor? You're married. Really? Now, we think that's just a dumb story because you didn't learn about that person. When you get married, you do some research. You date. You get to know them. You meet their family. You ask them questions. You talk about things. That's the factual side. But then there's a commitment part, and it's all loaded with those little words, I do. And what does I do mean? Better or worse, rich or poor, in sickness and health, till death do we part. Only in Christianity, at death is when it starts getting good. It's not parting at death. But I think that's the most we have. You learn a lot about this person, Jesus, and you decide if you want to say, I do. That's believe in the New Testament. It's a commitment. It's surrender. It's Peter and John both say it's walking in his steps. So it's a process. You walk with your husband or wife through life, and you walk with Jesus when you say, I do, to Jesus. So I explain all that to the group, and I'll say, well, let's jump into the resurrection. Verse 3. And Paul says, I gave you what I was given. Not grad level stuff, but it's extremely important. I gave you what I was given. Paul's telling you that the material he's sharing with you is not his. I gave you what I was given. Critics take 1 Corinthians 15 as authoritative. They think Paul's telling the truth. So what lesson do you get? Paul's sharing material with us that he was given when he first came to Christ. Now, in the New Testament, wish I had more time to talk about this, but ask your New Testament profs. In the New Testament, this has only come to light in the last 25 years. I've mentioned it. Well, I mean, it's been going on for 100 or two, but it's really been unpacked in the last 25, 35 years. In the New Testament, there are dozens of texts. These are not exactly synonyms, but they're roughly synonyms. We call them creeds, traditions, confessions. And it's the answer to the question, what did the earliest church preach during the years before the New Testament was written? Now, Paul says, here's my material. He says, I gave it to you when I came to Corinth. When did he come to Corinth? Some people say this is the most easily ascertainable date in the New Testament. He comes to Corinth about 51 AD. He's writing it about 55. He came to Corinth about 51. And he's saying, this is the material I gave you when I came to town. Wow. Well, when and from whom did he get this material? Well, I'm going to only be able to give you the conclusion today, not all the reasons, but most critics, in fact, Richard Bauckham says it is the consensus New Testament position today. He's a Cambridge professor. The consensus New Testament position is that Paul received this material. Here's ground zero, about 30 AD. Paul received this material at about +5. If it's 33, it's 38. If it's 30, it's about 35. How do you get that date? Well, Paul's authoritative, yes. Paul does the math for us. Here's the math. Jesus died. When does Paul become a Christian? It's about 1 to 3 years after the cross. That's like asking you, when does Acts 9 in relation to Acts 1? About 1 to 3 years. Let's take an average. Paul meets Jesus on the way to Damascus at about +2. He says, 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem. 2 + 3. You say, well, I think Paul was converted at 1 year after. Okay, great. +1, 3, +4. No, I put his conversion. I'm a late dater. I think Paul's conversion was +3. Okay, good for you. Now he's in Jerusalem. At +6. In ancient historiography, this is called early. In ancient historiography, we have almost nothing like this, where our sources go back to just, if he's converted 1 year, 3 years later he's in Jerusalem. where he's in Jerusalem 4 to 6 years after the events themselves. 4 to 6 years. And critics almost unanimously, even the Jesus Seminar, as liberal as they are, the Jesus Seminar says this text of 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following is pre-Pauline. What does pre-Pauline mean? Well, here's Bart Ehrman, the skeptic's explanation. Here's what pre-Pauline means. Here's the cross. Here's Paul's conversion. That's pre-Pauline. This is pre-Pauline. So if Paul gets this from somebody else here, how old is this material? In here, in this little slot, because it's pre-Pauline. I gave you what I was given. This is not my material. And what's so good about Paul? Paul was in the right time, right place with the right people, knew the eyewitnesses, and he tells us their testimony. When he went to Jerusalem the first time, he's with Peter and James. He said, I spent 15 days with them. Wouldn't you like to have been there in that meeting? 15 days. Then as our Galatians 2 starts, Paul says, 14 years later, I went back up to Jerusalem to make sure that the gospel I was preaching was the same as the gospel they were preaching. And who's there now? Peter's still there. James, the brother of Jesus, is still there. And John is there. You know why this is important? The big four are all together. Nobody in the early church was more influential than James, the brother of Jesus, not the son of Zebedee. He's dead, right? He's martyred in Acts 12. James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, and 2 of the 12, Peter and John. The four most influential people in Christianity next to Jesus himself. Paul's with all of them right here. You say, well, Barnabas was there too. Titus was there, yeah. But this is a conference. And some of you people have driven a lot of miles to come to this conference. If Peter, Paul, and Mary, no, Mary was probably there. Peter, Paul, James, and John are there, and you've driven a whole lot of miles to come and hear this apostolic conference called Defend the Faith with Peter, Paul, James, and John? Yeah, Barnabas is there, and Titus was there, and they're teaching the breakout sessions. These guys are the main speakers. Why? Because they're in the right place at the right time. They're the people we want to have when you ask, how do you know George Washington's first president of the United States? These are the guys you want. You want to interview Thomas Jefferson. You want to interview John Adams. You want to interview James Madison, right? These are the Jefferson, Adams, and Madison of ancient Christianity. And Paul knows these guys, and he's interviewing them. But 3 of them were together here. Now, we can do better than this. We can do better than +5. This is when Paul heard the material. If he got it from Peter and James, which Richard Bauckham says is the consensus New Testament position, if he got it from Peter and James, guess what? Peter and James knew the material before Paul knew the material. I gave you what I received. This is the I gave you. Sorry, that's the I gave you. This is the I received. From these guys. And they're reporting events that happened even earlier. Remember the definition of pre-Pauline? Pre-Pauline means the first 2 to 3 years after the cross. And the Jesus Seminar, as skeptical as they are, rejecting, depending on how you do the colors, rejecting 80 to 90% of the so-called red letter words of Jesus. They're that skeptical. And yet, they say this is pre-Pauline. They're going to tell you it's pre-Pauline. Is that early? You bet you. That's incredibly early. But Bart Ehrman says we can do better than this. Bart says we have several sources, and I won't have time to unpack these for you, but we have several sources, he says, which will get us to within 1 to 2 years of the cross. He says the earliest source material we have for the gospel message, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, the earliest material is 1 to 2 years after the cross. The gospel argument's fine because this fits historiography. Paul is great at plus 25. But we can get back to where Paul got this, who he got it from, in the events themselves. We have reports from 1 to 2 years later. And the critic says, yeah, but it's a miracle. Well, have you read Craig Keener? 1,100 pages of contemporary miracles ascertained by pre and post MRIs, X-rays, and CAT scans? Maybe we're naive for not believing in miracles. Maybe we better change our worldview. Maybe our glasses are getting in the way of reality. And things really do happen. Are there near-death experiences? Well evidenced? What's that tell us? There's another world. Wow. Then you mean these guys aren't naive? Apparently not. Wow. This is thought-provoking because we have data that go all the way back here. How do you know George Washington's first president of the United States? You want this kind of data. How do you know Jesus was raised from the dead? We have Paul, who got it from Peter, James, and John. Let me end with the pastoral thought, and I'm done. As time goes on, I'm very, very interested in saying things that I hope will meet people's needs pastorally. The resurrection just isn't, hardcore data. Nothing, what was that, Dragnet? They used to say nothing but the facts, ma'am? Was that Dragnet? We act like we do the same thing the atheists do. I want nothing but the facts. Just give me hardcore stuff. Well, that's not true. Christians want data, but we want something that we can live. We want something we can use to make a person's difference in a person's life. And nothing makes more difference than the resurrection. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15:58, he says, first of all, he says, be steadfast. If Christ happened, our faith is firm. Second, he says, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Next verse, I ask people, how do you know Paul was a Baptist? Next verse, he's taken up an offering for poor saints. 16:1, he's taking up an offering. But see, here's how his argument works. Jesus has been raised. What are you doing about it? We've got some poor people. Get your wallets out. That's how it works. Jesus has been raised from the dead. That means Christianity is true. That means we have responsibility to other people. Witnessing, meeting their needs. Christianity is practical. So steadfast. Your labor in the Lord is not in vain. And the third thing, back up a couple verses, 1 Corinthians 15. He says, death, where's your sting? Grave, where's your victory? And I tell people, this is not poetry. This is not what Paul's saying. Oh, death, where's your sting? Oh, grave, where's your victory? Read the commentaries. Paul is trash talking. Paul's trash talking. Why don't mothers let their boys trash talk? Because trash talking is all about me, right? Me. Paul wasn't talking about himself. He was bragging about the Lord. And he's going off on the devil. And this is the best practical benefit of all in the resurrection. Basically, Paul is taunting death. Paul is taunting Satan. Here's what he's saying. Satan, you got something on me? You've got nothing. You got, what? Yeah, I know. You can hurt me. I know that. Haven't you seen my list of suffering? You can hurt me. You're the God of this world. I understand that. But you're going down. You're going down. You couldn't keep my Lord in his grave. Loser. Where's your sting? Where's your victory? Because of Jesus Christ, I'm going to be with him forever someday. That is the practical import of the resurrection. Some of you know my testimony. My wife died. I'm remarried, but my wife died in 1995 of stomach cancer, mother of my children. And I buried my best friend in the world. I did not know when I started my resurrection research that it was going to have that kind of practical implication for me. Because Paul says if Christ if Christ wasn't raised, our loved ones have died in vain. But it's because of the resurrection. As one card someone sent me after the funeral, it said, think about the day when you go to heaven and you'll be able to walk hand in hand with your wife. That's the practical difference the resurrection makes. If you've lost a loved one, you tell me something more important than that. You lost a child? We just lost a child in not my immediate family, but my niece in Lynchburg. I did the funeral for this little tiny baby in a little tiny casket, just a little bit bigger than a shoebox. And we buried that little child. What do you tell a mother at the gravesite? You talk about the resurrection. Because Paul says we grieve, but not as those without hope. You know, there's a world of difference between grieving with hope and grieving without hope. It's because Jesus has been raised that we have hope. I leave with you the words of our Lord, John 14, verse 19. Because I live, you shall live also.